Fluorescent lights hum overhead like insects trapped in plastic, each one casting its own small shadow across the polished tile. Seattle General's night shift runs like a Swiss watch that nobody bothers to wind anymore. The machinery of Mercy keeps moving whether anyone notices or not. Danielle Ross moves through the hallways with the kind of invisibility that only comes from practice, from years of learning which corners to take, which voices to answer, which ones to let pass like she never heard them. 12 hours. In and out. Head down. That was the protocol she'd built for herself, the one that kept her alive in a different way than the Hindu Kush ever had. The scrubs are unremarkable, navy blue, standard issue, a name tag that says D.U. Ross, RN in letters too small to read from more than 3 feet away. 5 years she'd listed on her civilian resume. 5 years of Seattle General, working floors where they kept the cases that didn't need specialists, the stable patients, the ones who wouldn't die if she wasn't there. That was the deal she'd struck with herself. No crisis. No glory. No reason for anyone to look too closely. The jacket she wore over her scrubs hung loose enough to hide things, the tremor in her left hand when she held it still too long, the muscle memory that lived in her shoulders, the faded Special Forces unit patch sewn into the interior lining with thread that had gone gray with age. She touched it sometimes during shift changes, 2 fingers pressing against the fabric like it was a scar she needed to keep checking. Still there. Still real. Still proof that Captain Danielle Ross had existed, even if the government had spent 18 years convincing the world otherwise. Morning round started at 6:15. Always 6:15. Dr. David Mercer arrived at 6:12, which meant he spent 3 minutes reviewing charts while standing at the nurse's station, his presence taking up more space than his body should have allowed. He was the type of man whose voice carried a particular frequency, not loud, but designed to be heard. Tailored coat over his white coat, cufflinks that probably cost what Danielle made in 2 weeks, the kind of easy authority that came from never having been told no by anyone who could make it stick. He was tall enough to make people look up, which he noticed. He definitely noticed. Danielle checked the 4-on room for 12 before morning round started. 74-year-old female, post-op hip replacement, vital stable, pain controlled. The woman's hand trembled slightly when Danielle adjusted the drip rate, so Danielle let her grip her wrist for 2 seconds, not speaking, just present. The woman's breathing slowed. Her shoulders unclenched. That was something Danielle had always been able to do, even before the military training made it deliberate, made it tactical. She could walk into a room where people were afraid and something in her presence would tell them they didn't need to be. Not yet. Not right now. Your patient in 412. It was Janet from day shift, handing off the clipboard. She's asking for pain meds every 2 hours but her numbers don't support it. Might be anxiety. Danielle nodded once, taking the clipboard. I'll sit with her between rounds. Sometimes the fear hurts more than the surgery. Janet blinked at her like she'd heard something unexpectedly human. Most nurses didn't talk like that anymore. Most nurses had learned to talk like the hospital talked, clinical and efficient and fast. Danielle had learned a different efficiency, the kind that kept people alive in places where hospitals didn't exist. Okay, Janet said. Good luck with Dr. Mercer today. He's in a mood. The morning rounds assembled at 6:15 exactly. Danielle stood in the back corner of the conference room with the other nurses, charts in her hands, shoulders positioned so she could move without drawing attention. Dr. Mercer worked through the patients with the mechanical precision of someone who'd done this 10,000 times and found nothing surprising in any of it. He was competent, that was the first thing to understand about him. His assessments were solid, his orders were reasonable, his bedside manner was the kind of polite distance that made patients feel like problems being solved rather than people being helped. But his eyes kept tracking something. Danielle noticed because she'd been trained to notice, the way his gaze would settle on her for 3 seconds too long every time she referenced a patient interaction, every time her assessment contradicted what the chart suggested. Room for 07, he said, moving through his list. Pneumonia progressing despite antibiotics. Increase respiratory therapy to every 4 hours. She's been off antibiotics for 18 hours due to the rash, Danielle said. Her voice was soft, she kept it soft. The rash is clearing, but she's asking about stopping the vancomycin. I think she's getting better, not worse. The room went still in a way that meant she'd made a mistake. The mistake wasn't being wrong, her assessment was correct and Dr. Mercer would figure that out by noon. The mistake was speaking clearly enough to be right in front of people. She'd broken the invisibility protocol. Dr. Mercer's jaw tightened, just barely. His head turned slightly toward her, and for the first time in 2 years, he really looked at her. His eyes were pale blue, the kind of eyes that looked like they could freeze things. The chart indicates progressive infiltration, he said, his voice maintaining that perfect level of courtesy that made it somehow more cutting than actual anger. I think the chart and I will continue the current treatment plan. Yes, doctor, Danielle said. She was good at the deference, she'd had 18 years to practice it. Her eyes went back to the chart in her hands. Invisible again. But that wasn't true anymore. She could feel it in the way the other nurses were looking at her, cautious. She could feel it in the way Dr. Mercer's attention had latched onto her and wouldn't quite let go. Noticing. He was noticing her. That was the opposite of the strategy. That was the beginning of the worst kind of problem. The rounds continued. 6 more patients. 3 of them had assessments that Danielle had recorded, and Dr. Mercer contradicted every single one, not aggressively, never that crude. Just dismissively. Like her observations were interesting guesses from someone who'd read the right textbooks but hadn't quite understood medicine the way it was meant to be practiced. By the time they finished the last patient, the message had been delivered to everyone in that room: Danielle Ross was competent enough to be useful, but not credible enough to be listened to. It wasn't the worst day she'd had. The worst days came with explosions and blood loss and people screaming in languages her body understood even if her mind was trying not to. This was just the everyday kind of damage, the slow kind that wore you down by degrees. She could handle it. She had handled it. She would handle it. The thing she didn't know yet was that Dr. Mercer had only just started. 3 days later, the new patient arrived on a Tuesday. Danielle was finishing shift change, writing notes in the electronic chart for her 7 patients, when she heard the commotion at the main desk, paramedics checking in with a high-acuity trauma case, deaf Special Forces veteran, complicated injury, needs communication support. She didn't look up. That wasn't her flaw. That wasn't her problem. She had 90 minutes left on her shift, and after that she had a deal with herself. She didn't think about deployments, didn't think about the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, didn't think about the face of the medic who'd taken her position after the government had erased her records and sent her home with a classified discharge and a pension that required her signature on documents that said she'd never existed. But something made her look up from her keyboard. Some part of her that had been trained to hear danger in the way a room's energy shifted. The veteran was being rolled past the nurse's station. Mid-40s maybe, heavy bandaging on his left leg, a prosthetic right arm that caught the fluorescent light. But it was his face that stopped her, not his face exactly, but the scar tissue around his left eye, the particular shape of his jaw, the way his hands moved when he signed something urgent to the paramedic. She knew that face. She'd known it when it was younger and UN scarred, when they'd stood together on a forward operating base in Logar province with the Hindu Kush mountains turning purple in the evening light. She'd known it because she'd put him on the helicopter out of Sanjin Valley after taking shrapnel that should have killed him. She'd known it because when they pulled her from active duty 17 days later, he was the one they sent to replace her in the rotation. Specialist Aaron Halloway. Call sign Viper 5. The medic who'd gotten her job. The medic who'd gotten her life. She pulled the chair back from the desk. Her hands were steady. She'd had 18 years to practice keeping her hands steady, but something very specific and very dangerous was activating in her chest. Not panic. Panic was what civilians experienced. What activated in her was clarity. Focus. A sudden vivid understanding that the universe was about to ask her to break her own protocol and she was going to do it anyway. Danielle pulled up the new patient assignment on the computer. Room 521. Post-operative observation, complex orthopedic injury, communication support required. There was a note in the chart already, handwritten by Dr. Mercer, deaf patient. Will require interpreter services for patient education. Standard protocol applies. She was moving before she finished reading. She could feel the other nurses watching her, noticing the small shift in her movement, the way her shoulders had changed. The invisibility was cracking. She didn't have time to care about that anymore. The room smells like antiseptic and something worse, the copper undertone of fresh blood mixed with the metallic tang of fear. Dr. Mercer stands in the doorway of the veteran's room like he owns the space, his white coat still crisp at 4 p.m., his expression carved from something harder than bone. Danielle is adjusting the fall line when he enters, her movements precise, the kind of economy of motion that comes from muscle memory older than her nursing license. The veteran's wife sits rigid in the corner chair, her hands twisted together, her eyes red from 2 hours of crying. Nightingale, Mercer says, and the name lands like an insult. It always does. I think we need to discuss your approach to patient care. Danielle doesn't turn. She checks the drip rate, 18 milliliters per hour, perfect for the lactated ringer's solution keeping the veteran's depleted blood volume stable, and makes a note on his chart. The veteran watches her face. His wife watches Mercer. The fluorescent lights above hum their sterile song, indifferent to everything happening beneath them. This patient, Mercer continues, and now he's looking at the wife, performing for her, came to us with significant trauma. Shrapnel wounds. Possible internal bleeding. Tracheal deviation on admission. These are complex cases that require, he pauses, lets the silence build, appropriate levels of expertise. Danielle's jaw tightens. Just barely. The trembling isn't fear. It's restraint. Your role, Mercer says, stepping fully into the room now, his presence making the air pressure change, is to follow physician orders. Not to form attachments. Not to communicate in ways that bypass the chain of command. Not to convince patients they can trust you more than they trust their doctors. His eyes find hers. I've been watching you, Nightingale. I've been watching how you move through this unit like you belong in places you don't. The wife's breath catches. The veteran's hand reaches for the call button, but Danielle catches his eye and shakes her head, barely perceptible. Wait. Mercer doesn't pause. He's been waiting for this moment since Thursday, since he saw her hands moving in sign language, since he understood that competence in his hospital was a threat to the hierarchy he'd spent 15 years constructing. His voice drops lower, more dangerous, because he's learned that cruelty doesn't need volume. You went to community college, Nightingale. That's admirable. That's American. But it also means you don't have the education to interpret complex medical presentations. You don't have the training to make clinical judgments. You certainly don't have the authority to decide what communication methods are appropriate for vulnerable patients. He gestures at the veteran like the man is an exhibit. This patient needs certainty. He needs to know his care is guided by someone with credentials, with experience, with understanding of trauma medicine at the level required by someone who served in the Hindu Kush. 3 minutes. Danielle counts them like rounds downrange. 1 minute into his speech, her hand doesn't shake as she adjusts the monitor lead. 2 minutes, and her breathing stays controlled, each exhale measured, deliberate. 3 minutes, and when he finally stops for breath, when he finally steps back, expecting her to apologize, to defer, to crumble, she turns to face him with eyes like Arctic ice. You're terrified, she says, and her voice comes out flat, Arctic, the voice of someone who has already survived the worst, that competence doesn't need your permission. The silence crashes down like a physical thing. The wife's hand goes to her mouth. The veteran's expression shifts, recognition flickering across his face like he's seeing something he thought was buried. Danielle doesn't wait for a response. She turns back to the fall line, to the monitor, to the work of keeping a man alive, and her movements are fluid, precise, the terrifying fluid precision of someone operating in their element. She adjusts the flow rate by 2 milliliters, her finger steady as a surgical laser, and makes a note in his chart. The veteran watches her. His wife watches her. Mercer watches her. And then she walks past him like he's invisible, not a challenge, not defiant, just a simple acknowledgement that his presence is irrelevant to the work that matters. Her shoulder doesn't brush his as she moves through the doorway. She doesn't need the confrontation. She's already won. She just hasn't acknowledged it yet. Mercer's face goes white with something that looks almost like rage, but it's deeper than rage. It's the look of a man watching his entire constructed reality crack under the weight of someone else's certainty. The next morning, Danielle enters the break room at 6:51 a.m. with her lunch, turkey sandwich, apple, the kind of careful nutrition that comes from understanding that your body is the only instrument you fully control. She sets her bag on the counter. For nurses stand simultaneously, abandoning half-eaten meals, conversations that stop mid-word. The charge nurse won't meet her eyes. A resident finds sudden urgent business in the hallway. Within 90 seconds, the room has emptied like a held breath being released, and Danielle is alone with the smell of reheated coffee and the weight of something she's learned to carry since Operation Nightfall ended in classified failure. She eats her sandwich anyway. Slowly. Deliberately. Not because she's hungry, but because showing weakness now would be showing weakness forever. By afternoon, the news has moved through Seattle General like a virus through a bloodstream. Her name appears on the public disciplinary board in the staff corridor, the one that lists infection control violations and medication errors and all the small failures that constitute a career's erosion. It's printed in block letters: disciplinary action pending, Danielle Ross, insubordination and unauthorized patient interaction. Nurses she's worked with for 3 years walk past without speaking. The phlebotomist she once covered for during a double shift nods at the floor. The respiratory therapist who brought her coffee every morning for 6 months pretends she needs to check a ventilator across the unit. It's not malicious, what they're doing. It's worse. It's survival. Mercer's presence in the hospital has weight, institutional weight, and they all understand that proximity to Danielle is now proximity to professional danger. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part happened in the administrative hallway at 3:14 p.m., when Danielle passed Dr. Mercer on his way to the charge nurse's office carrying a stack of files. He was moving with purpose, with the kind of calculated precision that speaks of a man who's already decided something and is now simply executing the decision. His eyes met hers for exactly half a second, not a confrontation, just an acknowledgement that he'd seen her seeing him, that the game had moved into its next phase. She didn't know it yet, but he'd already made 3 phone calls. The first to the medical director, framing concerns about liability exposure and pattern of behavior risks. The second to the credentialing office, questioning whether her nursing license verification had been thorough enough. The third to his former chief of surgery who now sat on the state nursing board, just planting seeds, nothing explicit, just enough to make someone in authority wonder about a nurse who seemed to be exceeding her scope of practice in ways that suggested either arrogance or something worse. She didn't know that the schedule he'd requested from the charge nurse, all her overtime hours, all her arrivals before shift start, all her late stays tending to patients, would be framed in his documentation as evidence of someone unable to manage a standard workload. She didn't know that a formal request to restrict her access to critical care floors was already being drafted, written in language so professionally neutral that it would take an administrator 3 readings to realize it was character assassination dressed in bureaucratic clothing. What Danielle knew, standing in that hallway at 3:14 p.m., was that something had shifted. The invisibility that had protected her for 3 years had cracked the moment she spoke to the deaf veteran in his own language. The moment she'd acknowledged him. The moment she'd shown competence that didn't bow to hierarchy. And now the hospital, the system, the structure, the entire institution that required nurses to stay small and quiet and grateful for whatever respect trickled down from above, was moving to eliminate that threat. She walked to her locker in the nurses' station and opened it to the faint smell of stale scrubs and the unit patch she kept sewn inside her jacket lining, the one she'd carried since the classified disaster in Hindu Kush, the only proof Captain Ross had ever existed at all. Her thumb brushed the embroidered unit insignia. A reminder. A weight. A promise to someone she used to be. Tomorrow would bring morning rounds where Mercer would mention to the residents how some nurses mistake patients' gratitude for medical expertise. Tomorrow would bring whispers, careful, plausible whispers, about boundary issues and overstepping and the dangers of unqualified personnel confusing compassion with competence. Tomorrow would bring the slow, methodical dismantling of everything she'd built in 3 years of perfect, invisible work. But tonight, standing in front of her locker at the end of a shift where she'd been systematically erased from the break room, from the patient roster, from the professional courtesy that kept a hospital functioning, Danielle understood something that Dr. Mercer had never learned: competence doesn't need permission, but it also doesn't need recognition. It just needs to survive long enough for the truth to matter. She closed her locker, pulled on her jacket, felt the unit patch against her ribs like a heartbeat, and waited. The unit patch felt alive against her ribs as Danielle moved through Seattle General's corridors on Monday evening, her badge clipped to scrubs that bore 3 fresh coffee stains from the nurse's station where nobody would sit near her anymore. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song overhead, and she kept her eyes on the monitors visible through the glass partition of the intensive care unit, the same monitors that had started telling a story 3 hours ago that nobody else seemed to be reading. The veterans' oxygen saturation numbers appeared in the shared system like a slow-motion descent, dropping from 94 to 91 to 88, each number a sentence she understood in a language only combat medicine had taught her. She'd recognized the X-ray within seconds of pulling it from the digital cue: fluid accumulation in the pleural space, the subtle asymmetry of chest expansion, the chest wall mechanics that looked almost normal to an untrained eye but screamed danger to someone who'd treated this exact presentation in a sandstorm clinic outside Sanjin Valley. 3 soldiers in Hindu Kush had looked just like this before tension pneumothorax developed. All 3 had lived, but only because she'd moved fast enough. Only because she'd known what that X-ray meant while the symptoms were still whispering instead of screaming. The veteran's case had all the markers: post-surgical, positive pressure ventilation risk, those subtle radiographic findings that predicted collapse within hours. She'd filled out a transfer request at 6 p.m., asking for the veteran's return to critical care for continuous monitoring. She'd been a nurse at Seattle General for 18 months, and in 18 months, she'd learned the precise velocity at which requests moved through the hospital bureaucracy. This one hadn't moved at all. At 8:24 p.m., she'd found it on the floor's administrative screen, stamped red, marked denied, with a handwritten note in the margins: patient status stable. Continued monitoring inappropriate at this time. Dr. Mercer. The first page had gone unanswered. So had the second. She'd called the ICU directly at 9:15 p.m., keeping her voice level and professional, asking for a status update on her former patient, using the neutral language of a nurse requesting information. The ICU nurse had listened to her for maybe 20 seconds before saying, very quietly, "Dr. Mercer left explicit orders this afternoon. You're not to be consulted on this patient. He was very specific. If you call again, he wants to know about it." Danielle had thanked her and hung up. Now she sat in the cafeteria with reheated coffee she wasn't drinking, watching the clock move toward 11 p.m., watching the numbers on her phone's secure hospital app update every 10 minutes like a pulse she couldn't feel. The veteran's oxygen saturation had stabilized at 86. His heart rate was climbing. His blood pressure was creeping downward in the way that meant his body was compensating for something the monitors hadn't yet flagged as critical. The clinical presentation was textbook: tissue oxygen dropping, tachycardia increasing, hypertension beginning. The timeline was maybe 6 to 8 hours before pneumothorax progressed to tension pneumothorax, before the pressure inside his chest cavity would begin collapsing vessels, before each breath would make it harder to take the next one. Dr. Mercer had made 3 phone calls on Friday afternoon. She knew this because hospital gossip moved faster than policy, and because the charge nurse, Patricia, had mentioned it quietly while pretending to check supply counts near where Danielle was restocking trauma trays. He called the medical director, Patricia had whispered, avoiding eye contact. Then credentialing. Then someone at the state nursing board, his old mentor, I think. He sounded. Patricia had trailed off, and Danielle had understood. Strategic. Systematic. Competent in the way that made it official and permanent instead of just loud and cruel. She'd watched him alter the incident report from Friday's confrontation too. The incident report, the document that created institutional memory, the paper trail that determined what stories hospitals believed and which ones they erased. She'd had access to the preliminary version before it moved to final. She'd gone to print one routine chart note and seen it sitting in the queue, waiting for her to pass by. The preliminary version had noted, correctly, that she'd responded to a patient's needs during a medical crisis. The final version, available to all staff by Saturday morning, documented something entirely different. A nurse approached patient without authorization, escalated situation through insubordination, created hostile environment for physician, acted outside scope of practice by initiating non-delegated assessment. That wasn't even what had happened. But it was what the hospital would believe. Danielle understood institutional truth the way she understood survival. It wasn't about accuracy, it was about who had the power to write the narrative. Dr. Mercer had written a narrative. He'd also restricted her access to critical care floors by updating her security clearance through the credentialing office, the kind of bureaucratic move that looked like protocol and felt like a knife. She'd discovered it when she'd tried to swipe her badge at the ICU entrance on Sunday morning and watched the light turn red, the lock holding firm, the electronic statement of her exclusion playing out in plastic and circuit boards. Her hands had stayed steady while she'd walked away. Her breathing had stayed measured. She'd gone to the post-surgical floor instead and pulled the veteran's chart. Her security access on regular floors remained intact, and confirmed what she already knew: his doctors weren't looking at the right data. She stood now at 11:03 p.m., her coffee untouched and cooling, and walked toward the elevator. The hospital corridors moved around her the way they always did, orderlies and nurses and residents passing like ships in the night, nobody making eye contact because the unspoken rule had been established. Captain Danielle Ross was radioactive now, contaminated by insubordination, marked for removal. The elevator arrived with a gentle chime, and she stepped inside, feeling the patch against her ribs like a second heartbeat, like a reminder of who she'd been when people actually saluted her, when her hands had saved soldiers in situations where there was no bureaucracy to restrict her access, no policy to weaponize against her competence. The ICU doors were 30 feet ahead when she pushed through the stairwell exit on the critical care floor. She could see them from where she stood, the glass partition, the soft glow of monitors inside, the shapes of two night nurses moving between beds. She could see the veteran's monitor through the transparent wall. She could read his numbers even from this distance. His O2 sat at 84 now. His heart rate had climbed to 118. Everything was still compensating, everything was still within the range that looked normal enough if you weren't looking hard, which meant everyone was probably still looking just hard enough to think everything was fine. Dr. Mercer was standing at the ICU entrance, and he saw her coming. He stepped into the doorway like a man defending a threshold, his white coat perfectly pressed, his expression arranged into something that looked like professional concern. He was tall enough that he could control the physical space around him just by standing in it. He was confident enough that he didn't need to shout. "You were explicitly restricted from this floor, Nightingale," he said, and the nickname fell between them like something he'd been waiting to use out loud. "Turn around or I'm calling security." Behind him, through the glass, the veteran lay in the raised bed with his wife asleep in the chair beside him, and the monitors cycled through their mechanical rhythms, and the O2 saturation number flickered down from 84 to 82, waiting for someone to move. "Then call them," Danielle said. Her voice didn't sound like the voice she'd been using for 18 months. It sounded like it had sounded in the Hindu Kush, level and clear and carrying the weight of someone who'd already done harder things than this. She pushed past him into the unit, her badge swinging against her chest, and didn't stop walking until she reached the veteran's bedside. His wife jerked awake. His eyes, when he focused them, went wide. Danielle's hands were already moving before anything else happened, one hand reaching for his chart, the other already assessing the rise and fall of his chest wall with the precision of someone whose touch could read a body's secrets the way other people read words. The veteran's chest heaved once, wrong. Asymmetric. His left side rising higher than it should, the ribs beneath the hospital gown moving independent of the right side like a dancer out of sync with the music. Danielle saw it before the monitors screened it. 6:08 a.m., Tuesday morning. The kind of moment that splits time into before and after. His trachea was already deviating, visibly, sliding left like a serpent beneath the skin of his neck. Oxygen saturation plummeting on the monitor, 92, 88, 82, 76. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm, but it was fighting physics now, fighting the collapsed lung, fighting a war it couldn't win without help. Alarms erupted. High-pitched electronic screams that brought every head up on the unit simultaneously. Dr. Mercer was there in seconds, materializing beside the bed with the reflexive speed of a man who'd practiced this 1,000 times in simulators and seminars. He didn't touch the patient. He issued orders instead, his voice cutting through the chaos like a knife through water. Chest tube kit. Stat. In the locked supply on 3, a resident called back, panic fluttering in her voice like trapped birds. Respiratory therapy. In another emergency. ETA 10 minutes. Mercer's jaw tightened. He was a good doctor, Danielle would grant him that much. His hands moved with precision as he barked for equipment that wouldn't arrive in time, for imaging that wouldn't help before the patient's heart stopped, for interventions that required time they didn't have. The veteran's oxygen sat dropped to 72. His heart rate climbed to 142, then 156. The monitor showed the terrible rhythm of a body drowning in its own anatomy. Danielle moved. She didn't think. Thinking was for people without muscle memory, and her muscle memory was ancient, carved into her nervous system in a field hospital in Sanjin Valley while mortars fell like rain and her hands were steady because the alternative was watching a soldier die. Her body remembered what her mind had been ordered to forget. She was already reaching for the crash cart, her fingers finding the 14-gauge needle before her conscious mind caught up with her hands. Step back, she said to the resident frozen at the bedside. It wasn't a request. It was a command, the kind that came from somewhere deeper than rank, from the bone-deep authority of someone who'd held lives together in worse rooms than this. The resident moved without question. Danielle's left hand found the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. Anatomical landmarks burned into muscle memory. Her right hand palmed the needle like a weapon. The patient's eyes went wide, but he didn't resist. Special forces training, maybe, or the instinct to trust the person whose hands moved with absolute certainty. The needle slid between his ribs with a whisper of resistance. A pop as it penetrated the pleural space. And then the sound that meant everything. The hiss of air escaping. Pure, unambiguous, the acoustic signature of a lung that had been begging for relief. The oxygen saturation began its climb. 80, 82. 88, 94. The monitor's frantic shriek downshifted to a manageable rhythm. The veteran's shoulders dropped an inch as his body recognized that gravity had been restored, that air could move freely again, that he could breathe. His wife, who'd been standing frozen in the corner, collapsed into a chair with a sound like prayer. Dr. Mercer's face went through a sequence of colors, shock, understanding, then rage that flooded his skin crimson like someone had opened a valve at his neck. But he didn't shout. That was the terrifying part. His voice dropped instead, cold and methodical, the voice of a man calculating. Everyone out. I need to document this incident. The room emptied like water down a drain. Danielle remained, her hand steady on the patient's shoulder, her eyes forward. The veteran looked at her, really looked at her, and something flickered across his expression. Recognition, maybe. Or just gratitude. She'd never know because she was already turning to leave, and Dr. Mercer was already pulling out his phone. Within the hour, he'd made 3 calls. The first to the medical director, his voice smooth and concerned, presenting the narrative of an RN who'd exceeded her scope of practice, who'd performed a procedure without physician oversight, who'd endangered a patient despite her clear restrictions from the disciplinary board. I'm not saying it was intentional, he'd said, and that was the precise knife twist that made it believable. But we need to consider the pattern. The second to the credentialing office, where he described her unauthorized access to critical care units, her direct violation of administrative restriction, her apparent belief that nursing licensure entitled her to practice emergency medicine. I'm concerned about the hospital's liability, he'd said, and liability was a word that made administrators move. The third to his contact at the state nursing board, a former chief of surgery who owed him favors and had a low tolerance for nurses with delusions of competence. "Just wanted to give you a heads up," Mercer had said, his voice concerned, almost reluctant. "We may be looking at a formal complaint." By 4 p.m., hospital security was walking her out. 2 guards flanked her as she moved through the unit she'd worked for 18 years. The hallway seemed longer than it ever had before, each step a transaction with gravity. Colleagues avoided her eyes the way people avoid looking at car accidents, the knowledge that disaster exists just a glance away too much to bear. In the break room, the conversation that had been animated dropped into tombstone silence. The ICU where she'd just saved a man's life was off limits now, her badge deactivated, her access revoked, her presence officially erased. But before she left the unit entirely, she heard it. The deaf veteran's hands moving against the white hospital blanket. His wife leaning close, trying to understand, her face contorted with confusion. His hands moving again, more insistent. Signs no one else on the unit understood. Danielle paused for just a moment, long enough to see him looking down the hallway in the direction she'd gone, his hands forming the same shape over and over. Question marks becoming statements. Viper 6. Viper 6. Where is Viper 6? She didn't turn back. Her locker was emptied by hospital administration, 18 years of photographs, a spare stethoscope, a trauma shear with her initials worn off by use, all of it sealed in a cardboard box with her name written on it in black marker. Her badge was cut in half, ceremonial and final. Dr. Mercer watched from his office window as she walked toward the parking lot, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. The box was heavier than it should have been, or perhaps she was lighter. At 3 a.m., she sat in a diner on Highway 40, the kind of place that existed outside of time, where the fluorescent lights had been buzzing the same frequency since 1987 and the coffee was always hot but never warm. She'd been driving for hours with no destination, just away, and this is where her momentum had finally collapsed. The booth was vinyl, the color of old blood, and her coffee had gone cold in the cup the way things do when you stop paying attention to time. Her reflection stared back from the black window outside, a woman in civilian clothes, shapeless scrubs exchanged for jeans and a borrowed hoodie, no rank insignia, no unit patch visible, no evidence that Captain Danielle Ross had ever existed outside of sealed government files and classified operations. The government had erased her after nightfall, the operation in the Hindu Kush that had ended with her team ambushed and a choice made in seconds that she'd been paying for ever since. Officially, she was dead. Unofficially, she was a nurse named Danielle, and now she wasn't even that anymore. Her left hand trembled against the Formica tabletop, and she watched it with scientific detachment. Not fear. Never fear, she'd burned that out of herself years ago in a field hospital while mortars fell. This was something else. This was the trembling of restraint finally released, of a woman who'd been holding so much pressure inside for so long that the absence of pressure felt like dissolution. She'd disappeared before. The government had made sure of that. But this time felt different. This time felt permanent. She reached for the coffee cup even though it was cold, needing something to hold, some small object to anchor the weight of 18 years of silence. The cup was chipped on the rim. She ran her thumb along the break and thought about all the other broken things in this world that nobody bothered to fix. Her phone sat dark on the table beside her. She hadn't charged it. Didn't want to. Whatever messages were waiting, her son, her sister, hospital administration requiring her official response, they could wait until she remembered how to be a person again instead of a ghost. The diner was empty except for the night clerk who'd stopped looking at her an hour ago. Rain hammered the parking lot outside, and Danielle watched it with the detached interest of someone observing a documentary about other people's lives. Somewhere in Raleigh, a Special Forces veteran was asking in signs where Viper 6 had gone. Somewhere in a hospital office, Dr. Mercer was composing the final documentation that would end her career. And here, in this fluorescent limbo on a highway at 3 a.m., Captain Danielle Ross was learning what it meant to be erased twice. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that no one knew she was coming back. Her 17-year-old son walks into the hospital administrator's office at 9 a.m. Wednesday carrying a showbox that holds the weight of every lie that's been told about his mother. His voice shakes when he says the words that will change everything. "Mom, they need to see these." The showbox tips. Medals spill across the conference table like coins from a broken piggy bank, scattering across the unsigned termination paperwork, rolling toward the edge where hands scramble to catch them before they fall. Bronze star. Silver star. 2 purple hearts stacked like playing cards. A Navy cross. Each one catches the overhead light and throws it back like it's burning. The room doesn't go quiet. The room goes into a different kind of breathing, the kind that happens when people realize they've been standing next to something they didn't have permission to see. The deaf veteran is wheeled into the gathering, positioned where he can see the medals spread across the table like evidence of resurrection. His hands move before anyone can speak, muscle memory older than thought, fingers forming shapes in the air that translate to his wife's whisper, "Viper 6. That's Viper 6. The name hangs in the conference room like a call sign from a classified operation that everyone in this room except 3 people actually knows. Danielle stands at the back, hands loose at her sides, watching the realization crawl across their faces like sunrise. A Marine colonel in dress blues, visiting his father 2 floors up, steps forward and picks up the Silver Star citation with the reverence of someone handling sacred text. His voice carries into the hallway, steady as a sniper's breath. "Captain Danielle Ross, for conspicuous gallantry while under fire, led extraction of pinned unit through enemy territory, sustained hostile fire while maintaining security of 7 wounded personnel, refused medical evacuation until all squad members accounted for." The words land like ammunition. Each sentence is a bullet that pierces everything Dr. Mercer built in the last 72 hours. Dr. Mercer pushes through the crowd, his jaw working like he's chewing glass. This is clearly fraudulent. Nurses don't earn silver stars. This is a coordinated fabrication, and I demand an investigation into, but the words stop coming because a 2-star general from Fort Bragg is standing at attention, his posture so straight it could cut steel, his right hand snapping up in a salute that renders every word Mercer says invisible. The general's salute holds for 3 seconds. 3 seconds in which the entire room realizes that whatever Danielle was before she walked into Seattle General, she wasn't anyone's subordinate. A Pentagon liaison in a charcoal suit arrives an hour later with a briefcase and credentials that authenticate the code name Operation Nightfall, the classified extraction, the after-action report that lists Danielle's name alongside words like heroic and exceptional valor and leadership under fire. The hospital's chief of staff turns to Dr. Mercer with the kind of look that doesn't need words. "Please step outside, Dr. Mercer. We need to have a conversation." The video someone recorded, the moment Dr. Mercer's sneer flashed across his face, the way his hand moved in that dismissive wave toward the medals, the exact second his voice said the words "nurses don't earn silver stars" even as a general stood rendering honors, hits Twitter at 11:41 a.m. By lunch, it's been viewed 2.3 million times. By 3 p.m., it's on national news. The comments flood in like a storm surge, veterans groups saying things about respect and accountability, medical professionals flooding the thread with their own stories about Dr. Mercer's behavior, active duty special forces operators tagging each other with the message "Remember when we thought nurses were support staff?" The hashtag Dr. Mercer trends for 6 hours. 6 hours in which everyone he's ever worked with sees exactly who he is when he thinks no one important is watching. At 6 p.m., his medical school mentor, a legendary surgeon who'd built her entire career on the principle that every member of a care team deserves respect, who'd sponsored his fellowship, who'd written the letter that got him hired at Seattle General, releases a public statement that lands like a building collapsing. "I am appalled by the behavior displayed by my former student. His actions represent everything I fought against in my entire surgical career. His conduct toward a decorated veteran and a highly skilled nurse demonstrates a fundamental misunderstanding of what medicine is supposed to be. Effective immediately, I am severing all professional ties and endorsing the state medical board's immediate review of his conduct and his fitness to practice medicine." The words are surgical. Precise. She doesn't shout. She just removes him from the operating room of his own life. The state medical board opens a formal investigation within 24 hours. The nursing board files a counter-complaint for creating a hostile work environment. Seattle General's legal team discovers what the smart ones had suspected. The incident report from Tuesday has been altered, the timestamp metadata showing it was modified 6 hours after the veteran's successful recovery, after Danielle had already saved his life with a needle decompression at the second intercostal space, after the hiss of air escaping his chest cavity had meant he got to breathe again. 3 nurses come forward with documented complaints they'd been too afraid to file before now: intimidation tactics, credit theft, systematic verbal abuse designed to establish hierarchy through humiliation. The administrator puts him on immediate suspension pending investigation. His access credentials are removed by HR at 4 p.m. His scheduled surgery rotations are reassigned to attendings who actually believe in the work. His parking space is given to someone else by 5:15. Dr. Mercer sits in his office as the afternoon light angles through the windows, watching the world he built disintegrate in real time. The residents who'd laughed at his jokes won't return calls. His golf buddy from the country club texts that the club's reviewing his membership. His ex-wife calls to say she'd seen the video and actually felt satisfied for the first time in 3 years. He watches through his window as Danielle meets with the hospital board in the conference room 2 floors below, watches as the deaf veteran embraces her in the lobby with his arms shaking, watches as she signs something back to him that makes his wife cry. From this distance, from this height, from this particular vantage point of losing everything, he realizes that his entire strategic campaign, every carefully placed whisper, every weaponized policy, every call to his former chief who owed him favors, collapsed because he'd targeted someone whose service made his whole professional achievement look like a participation trophy. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint from slamming his fist through the glass. But even his anger doesn't matter anymore. 6 months later, Danielle stands in her new office at the Raleigh VA hospital, and her nameplate reads exactly what it should have always said: Captain Danielle Ross, Director of Veteran Services. The walls hold her framed commendations, the one she'd kept hidden like contraband for 18 years, and photographs from her Special Forces service, images of her in uniform with her team before the classified disaster in the Hindu Kush, before she'd been officially erased and reassigned to a life of invisibility. Through the window she watches the parking lot below, watches Dr. Mercer load medical supplies into a white transport van, his hands moving with mechanical precision. The medical board suspended his license for 2 years. Community service hours as a medical transport driver. His hands do the work he'd always believed was beneath him, the work that nurses do without fanfare or recognition, the work that nobody applauds. He'll spend 24 months carrying equipment and cleaning vehicles, and if he's lucky, if he actually learns something about humility, maybe he'll get his license back. But his career at Seattle General is over. His reputation is a graveyard. The deaf veteran who'd replaced her on her team, the medic who'd been doing her old job when an IED took both his legs and his hearing, works 2 doors down now as a veteran's peer counselor. He stops by her office every other Wednesday, signing coffee with his hands moving like they're asking a question and making a statement at the same time. She signs back always, and they sit in the break room together, 2 warriors in a place designed to heal warriors. His wife drops off their daughter for the VA daycare program Danielle started, a program that recognizes that healing happens in community, not in isolation. The girl is 4 years old and already learning sign language from her father, already understanding that there are different ways to speak and all of them matter. On Danielle's desk sits a shadow box containing the faded Special Forces unit patch, the one she'd kept sewn inside her jacket lining for 18 years, the only proof she'd carried that Captain Ross had ever existed at all. Next to it, a photograph of her son in his ROTC uniform, the same 17-year-old who'd walked into that administrator's office carrying a showbox full of evidence. He'd enlisted after watching his mother's vindication, proud to follow her service into a world that was finally willing to see her. The voice transformation is complete now. There's no deference in how she speaks to the hospital board, no careful neutrality in her tone when she trains medical staff on treating complex trauma. She is command presence without commanding. She is authority without demanding. The quiet nurse is gone. The captain has come home. During a training session for 50 VA staff members, doctors, nurses, technicians, all equal in this room because that's how Danielle runs it, she sees him through the window. Dr. Mercer, closing the van doors, his shoulders carrying the weight of fallen status. She doesn't feel satisfaction. She feels what soldiers feel when they see someone finally receive the consequences they earned. The veteran signs to her through the training room glass, his hands moving with that specific combination of respect and recognition. "Thank you, Viper 6. She signs back, "We take care of our own." Her hand touches the unit patch, and her reflection in the glass shows both versions of who she is, the nurse who heals and the captain who leads, inseparable now, finally visible in the same moment. The ones who have seen the worst often give the most. If you're watching this right now and you've ever been underestimated, ever been dismissed by someone who didn't bother looking deeper, share this story. Subscribe so you see the next one. Comment, have you ever judged someone only to find out you were dead wrong? Let's talk about the people we overlook who are saving lives in the margins.